Hey everybody, welcome back to Gideon Stuff. Today we're going to be tackling a controversial topic. No, not that topic. We're going to be talking about blade geometry. But before we get into that, let's briefly touch on that topic. And of course, I'm alluding to the kerfuffle, the drama with Artisan Cutlery / CGRB and their AR RPM9 steel. Now, I made 2 shorts just kind of addressing this controversy. It's still brand new. And I thought those shorts were really going to be the only thing I was going to say on the issue. But I think eventually I'm going to be forced to say more. We're not going to do it in this video. But those shorts, again, 2 parts. The first part has way more views than the second part. And the first part, the like to dislike ratio is like 50-50. So I can tell this is a topic that have a lot of people choosing sides. And I have a feeling that a lot of the dislikes on that video come from people who thought I was being too easy on Artisan. And if so, they did not watch the second video where I was a little bit harder on them. Because yeah, in the first video, I was a little bit softer, I guess is the word. But I think I'm gonna have to make a full video addressing this thing, this issue, this topic. And so keep an eye out for that drama. I'm gonna try and make it a productive video. Maybe I'll do a little bit of testing. We don't like to do testing on this channel. I have videos about why, but maybe we'll make an exception and do a little something and see what we come up with. As it is right now, I like our RPM9. I've had good experiences with it. I think it's, shitty that Artisan was giving us misinformation. That's obviously not okay. But I don't think it was malicious. I don't think they were intending to do it. I think their marketing team just didn't know what the heck they were talking about. So I err on the side of ignorance rather than deceit. So there we go. But we'll talk about that later. Today we're talking about blade geometry. And this is something that is talked about a lot. Honestly, and not surprisingly, one of the most talked about aspects of collecting knives is performance. Makes sense, right? And when people talk about blade steel performance or the performance of a knife, its cutting performance, let's say, when people talk about cutting performance, the conversation normally centers around 3 things: steel type, heat treatment, and geometry. And all 3 of these things have a huge part to play in the overall performance of your blade. But today we're just going to be focusing on the geometry because I think geometry is honestly the most important part. So there we go. There's my thesis already out there. We're going to be going through this video and doing a little bit of comparisons. Again, not testing. I don't like to do dedicated testing on the channel. Again, I have videos about why, but we do some comparisons, and I'm going to be talking about my experience with a bunch of different blade grinds and what I feel like is the most important factor to getting the most cutting performance out of your pocket knife. So before we get too deep on that, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of a rundown on a couple of different blade grinds. Now, a lot of you are probably going to be familiar with this information already, and if so, feel free to skip it. But for anyone who might not be familiar, definitely stick around and watch it. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and send you guys over to Professor Smart Alec. Yes, welcome to class. My name is Professor Smart Alec. And now that bumbling idiot Gideon's done with you, perhaps it's time that you finally learn something actually useful and, if I may say, even edifying. So today we're going to be learning about blade grinds. I hope you're taking notes. There will be a test on this. Gideon is giving you a test, correct? If he's not, he's doing you a great disservice. There are 4 main types of blade grinds. Each type has subsets and variations on them, but there's 4 main types that we're going to be covering today. The first type is the flat grind, as seen on this Syncut Serene. A flat grind is exactly what it sounds like. It's flat from the spine to the edge. In cross-section, it looks a little something like this. Pretty much a V shape. The blade comes down straight to the edge at an angle. This is a very easy blade to grind. This is a very easy blade to sharpen. But some of the downsides are that it does get thicker considerably faster as you sharpen it compared to something as like a hollow grind. So that is our flat grind. Speaking of hollow grind, as seen on this Civivi Dogma, is hollow. These names are pretty self-explanatory. It looks a little something like this. There's a better drawing right there. This blade is actually hollow because it's ground using round stones. So if you think about the side of an elliptical, that is what is basically cutting into your metal here. So you have kind of a scoop that goes the entire length of the blade. What this means is that this gets down to an incredibly thin edge. It's going to be very easy to sharpen. It's going to remain thin the longer you sharpen it compared to our flat grind. You may lose some degree of durability, but that may not be something that you care about. The next grind that we will talk about is the Scandi grind, as seen on this cold steel Finnwolf. Now, Scandi grind originates in Scandinavia. Who would have thought? And it looks a little something like this in cross-section. What this has is just one primary edge. There's no secondary grinding or anything. You just have your flat and then your edge right here. And this makes it very easy to sharpen. Basically, you just set your blade on the stone at that angle that is indicated by the grind, and you can sharpen away. It might be a little chippier. It's typically used for woodworking knives, but there is your Scandi grind. And the last kind of grind we'll talk about is a convex grind, as seen on this Katsu front flipper right here. A convex grind looks a little something like this in cross-section. And basically, it's the reverse of a hollow grind. A hollow grind comes in, and a convex grind kind of goes, it's out, it's convex. A hollow grind is concave, a convex grind is convex. And so you get kind of the opposite effect. You have very thick blade towards the edge, but it can result in a smoother feel when you're cutting, and it gives you a very unique geometry. It might be a little bit harder to sharpen, but it's definitely very unique. Again though, it is going to thicken up considerably as you sharpen it. Now these are the four basic geometries of knife grinds. However, like I said, there are variations, and one of the variations we can talk about are the multiple variations on the flat grind. Specifically, you can have a full flat grind where the blade is ground completely from spine to edge, such as on this knife. Or you can have a saber height flat grind, which means that the grind doesn't start until a little ways down the blade. And so you'll instead end up with something that looks like this. You'll have your regular blade thickness here, and then the grind starts, compared to just a grind like that. That's been it for today's lecture, students. If you have any questions, if you didn't understand any of the terminology we use, that's too bad, because you should already be familiar with terms like edge and spine. And if you're not, then obviously you're not qualified to be taking this class, and I suggest you change it. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to send you back to Gideon, where he will undoubtedly sully everything that I've told you here and just make a mess of the overall quality and content of this video. But I cannot help that, and hopefully you learned something here. Alright, I hope you guys had fun with Professor Smart Alec. He's terrible, I know, and as far as EDC YouTube professors go, he's got nothing on Professor Tim from Tim's School of Fish. But hopefully you learned something interesting. So for the rest of this video, we're going to be talking about comparing these different blade grinds. Obviously, you can't do a one-to-one comparison. They're all different. You can't compare apples and oranges, right? And we're not going to compare them in every sense either, because some of these grinds are better suited to certain tasks than others. But what I did want to do in this video was talk about how they feel cutting cardboard. I think that's a pretty common EDC task, and I want to kind of talk about their sliciness in that regard. We're going to tilt down. I record some footage that we'll get to here in a little bit, and then we're going to cut some other stuff. But when it comes to blade geometry, the most commonly talked about aspect is behind the edge thickness. I remember I used to be such a nerd for behind the edge thickness. I used to think that was the end all be all. I thought behind the edge thickness was so cool, and you'll notice in a lot of my earlier videos, I made sure to mention the thickness behind the edge on every single knife I reviewed. I don't really do that much anymore. And for a couple reasons. Number one, my calipers are broken and I haven't fixed them in a long time. But also, I haven't wanted to fix them. I haven't worried about fixing them because even before my calipers broke, I was not doing the behind the edge measurements. Because through my everyday use, I realized that I don't really think that's a very useful metric for anything, right? Now, it contributes for sure, and it definitely has a lot of importance, right? Especially when it comes to the longevity of your knife. But I just realized that it wasn't as important as I thought it was. Now, of course, on this channel, the way everything works is I talk to you guys from my experience. That's one of the reasons we don't do dedicated testing videos, because the testing I do is just carrying and using the knives. And what I was realizing was sometimes I was getting better performance out of a knife that on paper should have had not as good performance as another knife, right? And this got me thinking, why? Why am I seeing this? And the first thing I went to was, well, maybe it's the grinds. Maybe it's got something to do with the way the blade is treated. Now, we're going to come back to that, but real quick, I want to talk about a couple of comments I've received in the past where people have said things like, oh, for that price, it should have a hollow grind. Or one comment that I got on a video was I was talking about a knife that didn't perform as well as I was expecting it to perform. I said that I think it should have had a hollow grind on it. And the comment was, well, it's an inexpensive knife. You can't expect them to put a hollow grind on it. This Camillus knife has a hollow grind, and this was a $9 knife. So I think a lot of people sometimes think that there's a direct correlation between type of grind and quality. There really isn't. Now, a flat grind is a simpler grind. It's an easier grind to make. So especially if you're someone who's making your own knives, you're probably going to go for a flat grind. But really, a hollow grind is not that hard to do either. When I was experimenting with making knives, I did hollow grinds. I did a couple of hollow grinds. You just got to make sure you have a circular wheel or belt or stone or whatever it is that you're using. That's the appropriate thickness for your blade, and you can, carve into the metal and make your hollow grind. It's not that hard, and with today's manufacturing processes, I don't think it's really that hard to do. So yeah, you can see hollow grinds on inexpensive knives and expensive knives. You can see flat grinds on inexpensive knives and expensive knives. There's really no price difference between any grind. Now, like I was saying, each grind has specific uses that it's going to excel at compared to some of the others. The Scandi grind is a great example. It's a fantastic grind for carving. It's amazing for woodwork. Not that great at food prep, right? Not that great at food prep. And this is kind of beyond the grinds too, is the knife itself. Some knives are suited for some tasks that other knives aren't. So again, before we go on to that cutting footage, I want to talk a little bit about the knives that I like to see certain grinds on. let's bring out the CGRB Pyrite. This has a flat grind, and I think that's a great choice because this has a Wharncliffe blade. This is meant for utility cuts. And because of that, this comes down to a nice thin edge, but it's a little bit more durable. It's a little bit more robust because it's a flat grind. It's got some more strength coming down. So if you're going to be dragging this across surfaces, if you're going to be making some, kind of aggressive cuts like that, I think having a little bit of extra strength is great. The drop point pyrite, however, I think actually would be really, really awesome if it had a hollow grind. And the reason is because it has a short, narrow blade. Because the blade is not tall, there's not a whole lot of room to come down from the spine thickness to the edge thickness. And so you end up with a knife that's a little bit thicker behind the edge. And so when it comes to knives that are not very tall, I think it makes sense for them to be hollow ground to get as much sliciness out of them as possible, if that's what you're going for. Again, there are reasons to have a flat grind or other type of blade if your knife is intended for a certain task that grind would be better at. When it comes to breaking down cardboard, as you're going to see in our video that's coming up, fully flat ground broad blades are unparalleled. If you're breaking down lots and lots of cardboard, this is what you want to go for. Something like this. And for food prep as well, a broad, fully flat ground blade is ideal. Look at all of your kitchen knives. Go look at your kitchen knives. They're fully flat ground, broad blades. For passing through materials, for making long cuts, or for making kind of powerful but precise cuts, a broad, flat ground blade is where it's at. Now, if it's more of a gentleman's folder, something that's a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit slicier, maybe even like this Dogma here, the hollow grind is the right choice for this. This is the right choice. This knife is for slicing, and not necessarily powerful or big slicing cuts, but very, very acute slicing cuts. The other thing to take into consideration with these is steel type. You want a steel that can support the kind of grind you're wanting to put on it. If you're wanting to do a very, very thin hollow grind on a light duty knife, you can get away with making doing like a hard steel, right? Something that's going to hold an edge very, very precisely, maximize that edge retention. And that's what you're going for, maximize your edge retention. Tough steels are also really good for very thin grinds though, because they're so tough that they don't get as brittle. So balancing your steel with your grind type is very, very important. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut some cardboard, talk about this a little bit more. I recorded some footage weeks ago. Let's go ahead and flip over to that. It is a little bit dark. I was in the garage at night cutting this. I had a bunch of boxes to break down and thought this would be a good chance to get some footage, but we're going to go ahead and talk about that. All right, yeah, here we are in the dark garage. Let's start off with a hollow grind, seen here on the Civivi Ortis. You guys know how hard it was for me to find a hollow ground knife in my collection. I didn't have very many of my hollow ground knives lying around. We are in a hollow grind shortage. And now that I said that, you're all going to go and start buying up the hollow grinds. They're already gone. Anyways, Civivi Ortis hollow ground clip point blade. Let's see what we got here. Felt pretty nice. Felt real nice. To no one's surprise, that felt pretty awesome. That was on me. I came out of the cut. Felt pretty good. Pretty good. Next up, let's try, actually, next up, let's do a saber grind on this ramette. You know, that felt kind of the same, maybe a little bit worse. Let's go ahead and try a blade that's about the same size as the Ortis, but this is an almost full flat grind. Not quite, it's got a little bit of a thing up here, but close enough. Again, I'm going to say that felt kind of similar. Let's try a smaller blade that has a completely full flat grind, like on the Silk Fixie. That one did feel pretty good. It kind of slowed down there at the end, but that did feel really, really good. Interesting. Wow, I already went through that whole box. Holy cow. All right, a box of similar thickness. We're going out with a full flat grind broad blade. You know, this cardboard is actually a little more, maybe a little bit more resistant. I'm not sure if you can even see that in the dark, but we're going to stop for actually one more. That's the best so far. But I don't think it has much. I think if you want to get the best geometry, don't worry about the type of grind. Don't worry about the thickness behind the edge. Blade stock thickness. This Kudu light is about to tear shit up. Slippery cardboard. that's the winner. All right, and so for consistency's sake, we're also going to be cutting some cardboard using our Scandi grind and convex grind. Ow. I still have a cut thumb, so thumb studs and me have not been getting along recently. But Scandi grind first. Now, I'll be honest, Scandi grinds, the review for this knife should be coming soon, are not as terrible for EDC as I'd heard some people say. A Scandi grind is not going to be my go-to, but it does all right. And it feels, breaking down cardboard with a Scandi grind feels very interesting. It feels a little bit different. The knife moves the material differently. I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. I think a Scandi grind on a decent, moderately thick blade is going to feel better than a very short, a short blade with a not very deep or not very thin behind the edge saber grind. It's going to feel better than that, but probably not the ideal piece. Now for the convex edge. This is an edge that I really enjoy the way it feels going through cardboard. I think it feels really, really cool. Got the choil there. The convex edge feels very, very different. If you're going for big, long cuts, it works fairly well because the entire blade is basically a wedge, and so you're basically pulling the material apart as you're going through. For some like smaller detail cuts, like, you know, if I want to be really precise and like try and make turns in my cut, it's not real great. It does not feel very agile. It doesn't really move that well. So both of these, Scandi and convex edge, I wouldn't say either of them are optimized for breaking down cardboard, but the Scandi is probably going to be maybe a little bit better all around, even though, again, for those really long cuts, the convex edge feels very different, very smooth, really, really just really good, actually. Okay, so what did we learn? We learned that the grind really depends on the blade. If you have a tall, broad, flat grind, it's going to perform a lot differently than a shorter saber ground blade. So here's my takeaway, and here's how I think about knife grinds. If your blade is this tall, let's say an inch, or let's say an inch or less, if that's the width of your blade, an inch or less, you probably want a hollow grind. Unless it's a Wharncliffe or something, in which case maybe, you know, you'd be better off with a flat grind, but I think that can go either way. I've had some very thin Wharncliffe blades that were hollow ground, just that worked really, really nicely. So inch or less, probably better do a hollow grind. Absolutely make sure that you maximize your thinness behind the edge if that's what you're going for. But more importantly than behind the edge thickness is spine thickness, in my opinion. I think that spine thickness makes a world of difference. You can have a knife that's 20 thousandths behind the edge, but it's only 90 thousandths blade stock, and that is always going to cut better than a knife that has maybe 120 thousandths blade stock and its hollow ground comes down to 12 thousandths behind the edge. And the reason is because that hollow grind, because it does like this, you're going to cut through the hollow part, but then you're going to hit the spine, and it's not going to cut as well. If you have a fully flat ground blade with a very thin, very thin blade stock, it's going to pass through material like cardboard a whole lot easier. Think about something like the TRM Atom, or just TRM knives in general. Full flat ground blades, they're about 20 thousandths behind the edge, not the thinnest things that's behind the edge, but their blade stocks are very thin, and that makes them slice like beasts, absolute beasts. So when it comes to the talk about behind the edge thickness, I think spine thickness is way more indicative of your performance than your behind the edge thickness. And that's what I've noticed in my life and with using different knives, and also in doing just kind of, little videos like this. Your spine thickness matters a lot. Another benefit that you get from prioritizing spine thinness over behind the edge thinness is a little bit more durability. You're going to maintain a lot of durability if you have a fully flat ground blade that's thin, right? It's not going to be as durable as a thick blade. Obviously, making your blade thicker increases durability, but you'll have a very durable edge and a fairly durable blade overall. And for an EDC knife, that's really cool, right? That's pretty much optimized. For kitchen knives, that's optimized. You get strength as well as the performance you need. And for cardboard destroying knives like we were talking about, I think that's also the ideal. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you guys with this. Just want to share my thoughts because this is something that I hear talked about all the time. I hear people saying things about, behind the edge thickness and stuff. And I very rarely hear people talking about spine thickness. Other reviewers have talked about stuff, but I very rarely see it discussed in comments or anything. I will probably make more videos on this topic, just knowing me. I will probably follow up with other things. I've talked about how, behind the edge thickness isn't always the end all be all because different knives perform differently. Different knives are meant for different things. You can have good geometry without necessarily having an edge that's 12 thousandths. So anyways, thank you to my channel members. Shout out to them. That's your members at our cowboy level. If you want to be a member, there's a link below. We're doing a giveaway, so that's cool. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, comment below, and subscribe. I've been Gideon, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.